I were to give you $1 and I gave another person 10, chances are the guy with $10 is going to be able to do a lot more with what they've got than you can. And I think it's this parameter that we have to bear in mind whenever we look at 20th century socialism.
Yeah, but knowing good old-fashioned socialism and communism and any form of economics that tell you to grab the means of production, you'll probably be stripped of your dollar as it is given to the community and you only have negative 1 cent.
And socialism of any character for that matter, because truthfully, it's never created. It only ever emerges from the system before it, filled with all of the baggage that it comes along with.
Yes, socialism is not an economic system. Along with all the other Karl Marx economics, it is a cancer, and it can either worsen or stagnate a situation. Never improve or develop the situation at all. Just worsen or stagnate an already pretty disgusting situation.
2 years ago, if you remember, I made a video called The Parable of the Divided Island. And a lot of folks in the comments section called bullshit on my video because they drew a lot of comparisons between the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic.
They also mentioned the North Korea-South Korea debate, which, he fails to mention that. But you know what? I would try to diminish or not even mention the live action results of what communism is doing to a country, or socialism, or just Marxism, period. So yeah, good on him.
The East-West German split has been for the most part the calling card of gotcha moments from people who are critical of socialism all the time. One needs not go into any more detail. It's basically taken as a given. Well, obviously you'd live in the West. I'm here today to tell you that that sentiment is bullshit, to say the least.
He surely did say the least, but with the most words. I thought that he was going to do some revisionist history at least and say that the East is better than the West. But no, he mostly blamed physical problems for their economic and enablement of actual growth.
Why was East Germany, and for that matter, many other socialist countries, so poor by comparison to the West? Now, before we begin, I would just like to say I am referring to the DDR here as socialist, but I am actually quite critical as to whether or not it would constitute a socialist country.
Oh, Scotsman, where are you? Yeah, this is a new true Scotsman fallacy. I knew it would pop up somewhere in this video.
Not for the reasons you think, however. It's because there was never any revolution in the GDR to begin with. Largely, it was a factor of Soviet hegemony that enabled the growth of the separate economic system. So, in many ways, you might call it hegemonically socialist, but don't get me called out on that not true socialism card. Okay, let's begin.
That's basically the equivalent of saying that the 37 states are not truly part of America because they wasn't part of the American Revolution. And just because you call out you're no true Scotsman doesn't mean it still doesn't exist.
If you intend clicking off in a few, I'd just like you to go away with this. The whole way that this debate is framed is very, very misleading, because it implies that there was a simple 50-50 fair game split between the two sides. In reality, the situation was far more murkier. If we were to split England, for example, into two, based on historical groundings of North and South, then they would be competing on very different playing fields from the outset. Why? Because the South of Britain has far more wealth, more technology, and everybody would want to flock down into the South simply because of one thing: London, a world city. Even if we split by population, again, the South remains a whole lot richer. Countries design themselves around very specific geographical locations for this reason.
What North London lacks in economics, they make up for in culture. Do you know how many bands came from Manchester? I mean, we're talking about the Smiths, we're talking about the Bee Gees, we're talking about Oasis, we're talking about Stone Roses, we're talking about 1975. And you must ask, how come all these socialist or communist countries under the USSR didn't really have a cultural impact like that? Because because they stifled freedom of expression and independent businesses because they thought that everybody should relatively be paid the same and employed in the same work. And that's mostly the problem with socialism. It not only exclusively stifles economic freedoms, but it stifles social freedoms as well.
In my home county of Devon, the area is quite rural. We only have 2 relatively small cities, and about a quarter of the country is moorland. If Devon were to become autonomous, we would suffer without any outside assistance. For that matter, if you were to split the moorland areas off from the rest of Devon, the moor regions would suffer ever more so. This works in just about every single nation you look at. Some parts are richer than others. That's the reason why nations spend decades building up specialities based on that geography.
I was wondering why he would bring up a failed state like the Confederate States of America that didn't even last for 5 years, but then I realized the USSR and the Confederate States of America was basically the same. Both of them rep red, both of them were controlled by neckbeards, and both of them enslaved people, you know, the gulags, plantations. So yes, it makes sense that he would reference the Confederate States of America.
Now we have to recognize this when we look at Germany. The split was not in half. Like physically, it was not in half. It was more so into thirds, with the West Division keeping the bulk share of the entire country.
Alright, all of this is irrelevant when you factor in that China, a place that is 100 times larger than Taiwan, which is where the original government of China had to fled to when Chairman Mao won, is doing much better than China economically, socially, and politically. So it doesn't matter how you split it. No matter how much land these commies will get, they'll always fail. Just look at North Korea. North Korea is larger than South Korea, yet North Korea is in the shitstorm they're in.
And what were the conditions in East Germany at that time? Well, as it would so happen, the eastern sections of Germany suffered the most devastation. Dresden, Leipzig, Dachau, Magdeburg, Chemnitz, Halle, and of course, Berlin, were all destroyed after World War II with their urban centres in tatters. And the areas around also lost a lot more due to the Russian invasion after.
I call the USSR Empire the manifest destitute.
Afterwards. In addition to this, East Germany has always been historically poorer and less industrialized than the West. If you look at the German population density in 1900 and I overlay it onto the East here, it never had the same degree of hustle and bustle as the West. Despite making up a third of the space of modern Germany, it had 17 million people on a 40-year average. Whereas the FRG averaged 58 million people with just twice the space.
Yeah, I'm not buying this whole East Germany have always been poor. Even if it always been poor, here's the thing. It's kind of like a mom who's caught giving her child some alcohol or some vodka when the child's 5, and then her excuse is, well, the baby was born with fetal alcohol syndrome. I mean, it's not a good excuse. I mean, I would think that communism or whatever type of system would try to make it better, or at least have some sort of difference other than mass poverty and starvation.
The East has historically been the breadbasket area of Deutschland, not the manufacturing hub. And there's actually a lot more to this than simply the agricultural aspect. Like I said, not all economic areas are created equal. And during the 21 years, the eastern half of Germany was mainly based around an export economy. And so for this reason, it was reliant upon outside and internal German support in order to strengthen its standard of living. Whilst the western parts were focused on heavy industry, the east was focused on agriculture, textiles, light industry, and Zeiss lenses.
You know what was also the breadbasket of a particular continent? Zimbabwe. That's before the price gouges, that's before the price control, that's before the government owned all the land, which they did not give back to the native black Africans. I just like to point out that no matter how much resources communists have, they'll always find a way to waste it. And that's what I just like to state.
Ask who and what did the DDR have to trade with in this new age? Whilst the West had access to the large American-funded free markets of Western Europe, socialist states had Comic-Con. Yeah, I know. Now, this was basically a smaller market for most of the socialist countries, but more importantly, it only had access to far more, at the time, developing and poorer nations. Albania, as a good example of this, only had its industrial revolution during the 50s and the 60s. In 1945, 5% of the population knew how to read and write. That's like devastatingly low, less than Russia.
If your economic system only brings the undereducated and poorer class, what does that say about your economic system as a whole? I mean, the only communist country I know that actually trades with free markets are Cuba. Cuba trades with, Canada, even though we have an embargo against them.
The Yalta Conference happened, and Germany was split into 4 areas. The East and Western powers had different ideas about what they wanted Germany to be. The USSR wanted Germany to be unified, in part because this would allow the whole of Germany to pay reparations for the devastating losses that the Soviet Union incurred.
So, Great Motherland Russia wanted a Treaty 2.0 so Germany could be unified to have Hitler Jr. take over and almost kill them again. Gotcha.
America, on the other hand, wanted Germany to become the hub of markets in Europe, as the American financiers who funded the war needed places to then spread their global dominance in the years after.
No, actually, America wanted the UK, hint, hint, it was to be the economic superpower of Europe because, it was their only ally they could trust.
Brewing, America wanted Germany to be a heavily militarized area to pose a threat and a difficulty to the Soviet Union, something the Chicago boys would later call enlightened self-interest. The USSR wanted Germany to remain demilitarized to prevent reprisals, even at one point offering the creation of a unified, non-aligned Germany with free elections and international supervision.
There have literally never been a communist country that has free elections. There was no free elections in Russia. There was no free elections in Cuba. There is no free elections in North Korea. There have never been a communist country with free elections. The closest you got was a election where you could pick one party candidate, one candidate. So I'm skeptical that they even was serious when they came to the idea of free elections. It was a trap.
A side note I just want to bring attention to, we generally tend to think of the Eastern nations as the Red Bloc, the Communist Bloc, the Soviet Bloc, and thereby just stating that they were effectively ruled by the Soviets and their leaders were all just puppets. You can say that if you want, but you can also make a similar case for West Germany, France, Italy, and Greece being American puppets. France was basically completely indebted to America thanks to the Marshall Plan. It wasn't just aid, it basically allowed the US to have a free market in advertising throughout the entirety of Western Europe.
If you check out the original video, the like-to-dislike ratio is pretty bad. He has 8,000 dislikes and only 14,000 likes. And it's partly have to do with this, because people who know French history knew that Charles de Gaulle wasn't a puppet of the US. He actually took France out of NATO so France could stand by itself and be independent.
Europe. And let's not also forget about the rigging of elections, as America loves to do. America rigged Italian elections in 1948, Japanese throughout the entirety of the 50s and the 60s, the Philippines in 1953, just to name a few.
Citation needed, and I always thought that we as Americans either kill or fail to kill like leaders that been elected by the populace, like what we did in like Chile, where we put a dictator for like 30 years, but that was more of a military coup, but still citation needed.
America had this power, and it had far more wealth to give. During the war, its economy was the only nation that fought in it that went up as a result. And so during this time of rubble in Europe, it granted free range of opportunities for the United States to use and take advantage of.
That's because, except for, I don't know, Alaska and Hawaii, America, or at least mainland America, is too far for most of Germany and Japan to even hit. And plus, we have the third largest population. I think it was still back then the third largest population, and everybody has guns, so nobody was going to bomb America. Whose fault is that?
The USSR, the other superpower, had lost 1/6 of its population. Entire villages and towns across the country had been destroyed. In Belarus alone, if you've seen Come and See, you know that 600 villages were burned with their inhabitants along with them. And this was not even the beginning of its history. For the past 30 years, the Soviets had endured economic sabotage, sabotage by landlords, famines, a civil war, orphan crises. Upwards of 7 million kids lost their folks during the Civil War. This might also explain why Russian cartoons tend to have themes of orphandom. Entire railways, 85%, if my statistics are correct, were lost. Factories, mines, and all manner of infrastructure reduced to fractions of what they once were.
And all of this could have been avoided if Russia, particularly Stalin, didn't purge its most high-ranking military leaders in the gulags because he was fucking paranoid. So yes, it is somewhat the Russians' fault for all this happening. Well, at least the period when Hitler came to power in like late 30s to early 40s. But yeah, not even the Russians, but the USSR, I should say.
So that was the background. America, by comparison, had achieved its industrialization by the 1860s. Russia only managed to get there by the time of the Second World War, and only just. So it was not in the nature of loaning out any funds so readily. If anything,
although I hate to say it, Russia had its quaint and short periods of being a very palatable competitor when it comes to being an enemy of the U.S. I mean, they were the first to send a person in like a space flight in the universe before the U.S., and there was many times where they had outnumbered us in nukes and bombs and stuff like that, especially during the Jimmy administration. So yes, there wasn't just these pushover economic slouches that you paint them to be. They had periods of economic mobility when it came to technology
itself. So all of these factors were instrumental in East Germany being on the worse playing field than the West. It had a poor industry to begin with, there was a grander devastation, a lack of markets, and it had to pay reparation. Now that all contributes, whether you like it or not, to a much poorer society, and it's not just socialism. The overwhelming majority of socialist economies grow faster and improve the general quality of life when you take in relative economic conditions into account.
I mean, if you move from, I guess, a van to a trailer park, technically your life have gotten better compared to a person who moved from a mansion to a castle. But still, I like the mansion to castle move better than the trailer park one. Even though you're moving on up with the first scenario much better than the second, but hey.
And as we can see from East Germany too, it did grow faster in spite of all the hardship that was pressed against it. Upwards of 600% versus the FRG's 400.
You know, a tick can jump 150 times its body length, but a cheetah can't. Therefore, the tick is a better athlete. But no, all kidding aside here, I'm going to stop right here before he pretty much does wall apologetics. Please like and subscribe this video and subscribe to the channel I'm in. And stick in for part 2 where he justifies the wall. I'm out, guys.